Mr. Javier, how are we,
What's
sir?
up?
Oh, we're doing all right. I was reading a book on how regret is actually good by Daniel Pink, so that was pretty sweet. It's actually a really good book. I like Daniel Pink. He did a book called Drive a long time ago, A Whole New Mind. And it was talking about how without regret, you actually can't make good decisions, and how regret is
Mm.
kind of contingent, where we tend to say, oh, in my life, I have no regrets. And he's like, well, it depends on what you mean by that. Do you mean you've never made a bad decision? And he's like, I doubt that. But by regret, it's almost like regret is a result of not using regret to make a good choice. That's a regret where you don't use regret in a kind of sublimated manner. And I thought
Mm.
that was really interesting. It actually made me think of your philosophy of timing, which I really liked. I really liked how you brought the idea of well, because it's funny because as I was listening to you, it's kind of like we talk about time
Mm.
outside of timing, which is weird because then we treat time. What it made me think is how we treat time like space, actually, like it's a thing. When to treat time like time is to treat it like timing. So I liked what you were saying.
Mm. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, it's funny because I was going to do a second part, and then
Nice.
Substack decided to just completely just be like error, and then it completely erased my entire recording, and I was like, okay, cool, I'm gonna have to do this another time. But uh, but yeah, speaking of regrets, I've been reading a little. I've been getting into Caputo lately.
Oh yeah, Caputo, weak theology cat.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Tom, look at this beautiful soul. Tom, good to see you. I love this
Mr.
guy.
Daniel.
Yeah, how are you doing today, Tom? You doing okay?
Yeah, I'm very well. How are you?
Excellent. I'm doing fine. It's wonderful to see you. Javier, this is Tom from Voicecraft. We
Nice.
just had a session the other day on Levin.
Regret, the notion of regret actually, I think, is something similar to I think even what Caputo might even be aiming for with the theology of perhaps,
Ah,
right? This sort of like open-ended hoping against hope for the possibility of the impossible.
hmm.
um, and I always like his like notion of perhaps, but I think he even acknowledges that his perhaps turns into like a kind of like this misinterpreted maybe. I think that's the danger.
Hmm.
Um, but I do like his sort of open-ended idea of like instead of being, God is an event or the name of an event. And so he turns it instead of being, it's may being, it's a may being kind of thing. But I am fascinated in him in the sense that he is trying to sustain an open-ended encouragement,
Hmm.
say, or sustaining of uncertainty. That is what I admire from Caputo right now.
Hmm.
It's
Hmm.
sort of he's trying to figure out, at least in my opinion, so far from what I know, is that he's trying to sustain this element of uncertainty. And I think his theology of perhaps is one answer to that sustaining, at least for post Christianity, which I think is perhaps a bigger turn than I expected.
Hmm.
From Caputo,
Hmm.
especially when we compare Marion and Caputo. That's fascinating.
Right, right. Oh no, that's it. And Jacob. Jacob's here. What a delight. I love this guy. Jacob. No, it's quite interesting with Caputo. One of his books, he starts off saying something like, grateful for Derrida for loosening my tongue. Kind of this idea that where Derrida is introducing a very high level of uncertainty to philosophy, precisely deliberated. Jacob, what a pleasure to see you, sir. Thank you for being here. It's a pleasure. Jacob is awesome, everyone. I love this guy. And we're actually talking about some very relevant subjects, Jacob. So that all works out. So good to see you today. Are you doing well, Jacob?
I'm doing great. Thank you, Daniel. It's good to be here. I'm always trying to catch this call and never quite getting it. And this is my first successful arrival. So it's good to
Bam.
be.
Well, it's wonderful to have you. I love your background, by the way, is what it's called. But yeah, so Caputo has this kind of idea that Derrida is actually good for theology, and maybe even like a James K. Smith and philosophy in general, in the sense that he makes it all contingent. So, one of the reasons like Caputo wants to emphasize the weakness of God on the cross is precisely so that God does not become an escapist concept, where you find divinity precisely in humility, in weakness, and letting powers dominate you, because precisely it's in the Roman power, say, dominating Christ, that then Rome is defeated. it's like it kind of turns on itself and it shows its own internal incompleteness or its inability to complete itself precisely in the death of Christ, right? So there's actually a kind of power and weakness. So likewise, when he's working on the maybe and the perhaps, very often when our thinking doesn't entail any sort of perhaps or contingency, that's when we get into real trouble, because we're not open to uncertainty. We're not open to our plans for how things are supposed to go not working out, right? And like, Caputo will talk about Jesus almost like this giant sort of like asteroid going off, in the same sense of, oh, you thought that's what the law meant, Pharisees and Sadducees? Well, actually, I'm here to tell you that, if instead of when they take out your eye, you just take out an eye, you're actually going to turn the other cheek now, actually, because the whole thing is developing. And this was the intention the entire time. It's just that your hearts were too hard early on to be ready for this. So there's this kind of like a bomb going off, right? To sort of show that the things you thought you understood fully or had a full grasp on actually entailed within them kind of a clock that was ticking to go to the next phase. So there was a contingency that was always embedded. So you can never be too comfortable with what you think is the case. So Caputo really wants to introduce that kind of clearing, that Derrida'ian clearing into theology by emphasizing the weakness of Christ. And you can also think, if we're talking about Daniel Pink's regret, there's a way in which, you can make sure you don't have regrets by not taking any risks, right? By playing it safe, right? Well, is that really a good thing? By playing. Now, there's a kind of regret, ironically, what Daniel Pink was kind of talking about too, is there's a regret that comes from not doing anything that is risky too, right? Like you don't take a risk because you don't want to regret, say, trying something that other people won't appreciate, but then you regret not doing it. And he's kind of talking about how you can use regret as a way to positively push you forward into being willing to take that risk, willing to try something that other people don't fully understand, willing to do stuff that's scary. And that actually can be a positive force if you do that, which makes me think of Caputo, and then I'll pass it on to whoever wants to speak. In the sense that the notion of thinking of God as being located in weakness, which sounds like you're taking away from God, actually can be something that makes him more present in one's life, or actually has a bigger impact, because instead of using God to sort of as an escapist principle, or to give one a complete map that saves them from the terror of the territory, instead, you're actually being unveiled to the fullness of life. Likewise, being aware of using regret to actually be fearless or to take on risk or different things can actually have a positive impact. So both of those relate to me in different ways.
This idea of weakness has been like fascinating me more and more, at least from Caputo's point, because lately I've been thinking about Achilles' heel, right? Sort of Achilles' heel is that point of weakness for him, and yet ironically that is actually what sort of makes him, that vulnerability point is like what makes him, I guess, more known. It's like you can't know him without his weakness, so to speak. He isn't really Achilles without the Achilles heel, right? But it's fascinating because actually the weak point shows the possibility of actually killing the impossible, right? That at least for Achilles, right? Because Achilles, from what I understand, is like he's immortal, right? Something like that, and so the only way he could die is by the strike of the heel,
right?
So I do like Caputo's kind of like perhaps, because it does point at this, that the vulnerability point is actually a point in which is completely unknown. It does raise the possibility of perhaps he could die. Perhaps God actually could die. Perhaps God never arrives. And I do like that kind of thinking about weakness more as sort of like, it makes a clearing, I think. I actually do think it makes a clearing if we look at weakness in a real way. And I think we can cater towards weakness in the sense of where we need to face for courage, for things that we need to face, which is, I feel like this is something that needs to be like, I guess, a phenomenology of weakness maybe needs to be talked about more often. Because I do think we are leaving that paradigm of like power and as Caputo kind of says, or the sovereignty of God is dead, so to speak.
Well, it makes me think of the difference between thinking to avoid weakness or to avoid vulnerability, and to have certainty, and thinking that is, how do I live with weakness and uncertainty and humility? Like a thinking to avoid scary things and a thinking to build courage. That's been a theme. We've been talking in a lot of these net conversations where the meaning of life is courage, is like Mr. Ebert's statement. It's about having courage. And very often we can think about, I think it's also got beauty, truth, and goodness too, but courage is kind of a part of it. But often and this gets into the Levin talk we had at VoiceCraft the other day, where we consider good thinking or good science or good philosophy things that remove unknowns and the spooky and things that is going to give us a better grasp on life. But really, it seems what's very important is a kind of thinking that knows how to do the dance of life, how to time, to use your thing on Substack, Javier, the philosophy of timing, or the philosophy of how to respond to risk, the unknown, the frightening, and how to live with weakness and incompleteness, as opposed to think in a manner to deny it. Because once you start thinking that way, you start ending up in self-deception, totalitarianism, creating things that maybe you're not thinking about what the consequences of it might be, because you're so desperate to try to escape your own pathologies that you just are making different things so you can run from yourself in different escapisms. And so turning philosophy that way, and the last thing I'll say before passing on, it reminds me of something I wanted to say last week, where we made this distinction between how children have ambition. A lot of adults have endurance, but very few people have passion, which is ambition that you're willing to endure for, right? And we were making that kind of move. And it made me think how a lot of philosophy has stayed in the endurance realm. Like there are philosophies of endurance. So for example, you endure the phenomenon because you can never get to the noumenon. You endure, say, finitude because you can't get to the infinite. And we don't have much philosophy of passion, which would get into things like timing, or a philosophy of how to live with vision and how to endure in a manner that's not just enduring like Nietzsche's camel, but instead is also creating like Nietzsche's child. So this kind of philosophy of passion, which also sees itself as part of the world it is thinking about, and having the courage to be part of its creations and to be created in that process, as opposed to just philosophies of, oh, how do we endure phenomenon because we can't get to the noumenon? Oh, how do we endure, the unjust society because we can never get to Plato's just society? It's kind of like a philosophy of endurance that's going on, as opposed to something that's really going to be getting into the questions of what does it mean to live with a vision and to have ambition, but to also endure the suffering that comes with that vision. And that, I think, gets into subjects like what you're saying on weakness, timing, and so on and so forth.
There's something about weakness as well, where it seems like where the most passion is found is actually by going directly through the weakness. Sort of like the weakness is residing in the heart. And if one can just step into that and move through that, there is a deeper truth that's found on the other side. And I think a lot of these moves that are being made to try to kind of open things up and sort of hold things a little less tightly and be a little less certain, sort of feels like this maturity, this spiritual maturity that kind of, by opening up to the weakness, we are exposing ourselves to more of the complexity that kind of sits just beyond this rigid certainty that we try to create for ourselves. And so I think perhaps in the same way that Jesus was this asteroid, perhaps there is another time upon us where we are making a similar move, where we are kind of willing to step just outside of our structures and kind of invite more of that uncertainty and that complexity and kind of hold it more gently so that we can keep it alive.
Well, it makes me think too, if none of us are truly invincible, right? And if none of us are truly omniscient or omnipresent or whatever, then actually all of us has some degree of weakness to ourselves. Otherwise, one is kind of denying reality. And it's interesting to think that so much thinking or science or philosophy or whatever is really sort of catered around ignoring that or solving that away or pretending like that is not the case, which then leads to almost a pathological relationship with it, because you have to make sure that it never unintentionally unveils to you your weakness, or it unveils to you that a quote unquote asteroid can come and shatter the entire thing. So you get this very interesting pathological relationship with all of these fields of thought, systems building, and different things. And then the great Mr. Chetan has walked in. He had a wonderful paper in the Hegel Anthology on how one cannot separate theory and practice, and that one is always engaged in both simultaneously. Well, right there would be introducing, removing armor that could protect you from encountering error or weakness or having to fix things as you go along, because a lot of times we can actually create theories as a sort of armor from life, and if life doesn't meet the theory, it must be because the world got it wrong. It can't be that the theory is wrong, the world must have got it wrong. And that also, and then I'll pass it to whoever wants to speak, it makes me think of Raymond's great book on Notes from the Pod. I really like Raymond Owen, where he talks about how in the story of Prometheus, his brother was handing out, the claws to the animals, the fur to the animals, all of these different things. And he got to human beings and he went, oh crap, I ran out of stuff. Sorry, guys. I don't have anything for you. I don't have any fur, don't have any claws. And the interesting idea of the story is that and Raymond brings this out, is that it's precisely the nakedness, the weakness of human beings that forced them to then work together. And that's when you then got politics and you got society. And that's actually then why humans came to dominate or be create civilization, where the bears and the wolves and different things are just out in the mountains, not forming society. Because precisely the vulnerability of human beings made them work together in not having the fur and the claws, because Prometheus, his brother, forgot to give those to human beings. And that actually incentivized humans to work together. And that's actually why they had those strengths. So what's so interesting there is that it's the weakness of human beings that then forced them to work together to make them so incredibly strong, because they didn't have claws, because they didn't have fur like all the other animals. And then that would suggest, though, the more human beings move away from weakness or acknowledging their nakedness, maybe by hiding behind technology, hiding behind philosophy, hiding behind science, that's actually going to lead to them ironically being weak, because they don't have to work together or to think in terms of that weakness for strength. But let me pass it to whoever would like to speak.
Wow, I am very struck by the topic of conversation coming in here today. Yeah, it's surprising, but it feels like something that's been a very alive reflection for me over the last weeks and months. Have been diving into a lot of Christian texts for the first time, and having my own experiences in relation to that. I had a really intense dream of crucifixion a few weeks ago, so this contemplation feels like something that's happening inside me and outside me. And as a consequence of that dream and what was going on at that time, I found myself, at a point that I couldn't get past, at an irreconcilable meeting of two selves that I couldn't synthesize. And there was a moment in which I somehow opened that up and rendered myself unto uncertainty and received grace as a consequence of that. And that was a miraculous healing experience for me. One of a handful in my life, but one that feels particularly Christian in flavor. So coming into this conversation, I was like, wow, yeah, of course, this is the first time I come to the net in like 2 or 3 months of having got the emails, and the first damn topic of conversation is Jesus on the cross or something like that. Yeah. It seems as if the weakness or vulnerability is absolutely necessary for rendering oneself unto the whole or unto the mystery. Like there's no way to participate in it without being what we're calling weak. I think it would be, maybe there's some more defining or drawing out of, like, I missed when this word came into the conversation, but what we mean by weakness, and how, does that word only exist in contrast to strength? And then, I guess what we're saying is that the Christ person is subverting weakness into strength, by having this other dimension, for understanding the material realm, for understanding the immanent realm. So yeah, thank you.
Well, you're a good soul, Jacob, and it's wonderful to have you here. And I'll pass it to Javier. And the context of the word weak is there is a theologian, John Caputo, and he talks about weak theology. And indeed, from the tradition of Derrida, he wants to note how what you see in the Christ figure, and Zizek will kind of talk about this as well, is that weakness actually turns out not to be weakness. It's like sublated. It's like you think it's weakness. Precisely the moment of like God dying is the unveiling that, God is not dead, or that there's a sublation that occurs. In the same way that kind of in Hegel, precisely when thought reaches its limitation and it fails is what opens it up. Like all failure entails a kind of opening up to the next step of, say, the phenomenological journey. And so it's interesting because what we're getting at too with that, and then I'll pass it to Javier, is it's always interesting to me how, like, in order to be open, you have to be incomplete. Well, that's kind of weird. Because, a wound is open too, right? And an openness is also an armor. And so what you're starting to see is how these categories of incomplete equals bad, complete equals good, strength is good, weakness is bad. Well, no, it's a much more contingent structure. Because if you literally were invincible and you literally didn't need anyone, well, would you ever be motivated to enter community, right? Like if you never actually were open, could you ever receive? And so you start seeing this, and this is where Javier, and I'll give it to Javier, was talking about the philosophy of timing as opposed to, say, the philosophy of time. And we've talked a lot in these next conversations about philosophy as a kind of skill, a kind of artwork, as opposed to just the right ideas. And it seems like it's the ability to discern the difference between weakness that truly is bad, like a weak lung or something, as opposed to weakness that we actually call weakness, but it's actually the precondition for opening of relationship or the receiving of a new kind of strength. Well, that's a discernment now. It won't simply do to have a premise that says weakness is always bad, or even a premise that says weakness is sometimes good, because then you have to have the art of discerning when that is and when it is not. So you start seeing this entire dexterity that enters the picture. And another metaphor has been dancing. We've talked about jazz improvisation, all of these kind of art forms of sensing what's the appropriate way to carry oneself and what is not. Hopefully it's okay, but let me pass it to Javier and then Chitan.
Well, I think we really are like in exciting times in terms of like the way thinking is starting to turn itself towards uncertainty, because I'm really starting to see that now in just Zizek post-Christianity theology is trying to do this. I almost want to say, in terms of a Christian sort of terminology, we're in the age of like the doubting Thomas, but actually this doubting Thomas isn't a bad thing. What's interesting about the story about Thomas when he meets Jesus after resurrection is that he can't believe it, right? It's like impossible that he's resurrected. But what's funny is that Jesus actually encourages Thomas to feel his wounds, right? To really touch them, really. And I think that's almost similar to the age that we're in, where we're finally like, yeah, let's acknowledge that there's actually wounds and to probe around them and feel them. Recently, and this is going to be a little bit side off track, but I think it's going to come back together again. Recently, I learned about, because I'm a religious major, the Sufi mystic Al-Hallaj. He actually came up with a very interesting theory of Satan. He actually said Satan was the perfect monotheist, which is fascinating, right? Satan wasn't willing to bow down to anybody but God. So even when he created Adam, he's like, no, anybody but God, I won't bow down to. But even though Al-Hallaj looks at Satan as a sort of martyrdom, tragic figure, I thought this was an interesting take, because I feel like now post-theology, is actually still embracing the stance of man, where we're actually shifting away from trying to be a perfect monotheist. I think finally we're getting rid of that stance, because to be man, to be this vulnerable thing, to accept the possibility of looking at the weakness of God, I think this is what makes us more man and opens us up to something other than trying to achieve or being a perfect monotheist, like Satan. And there is something deeply ironic about eating the apple, gaining this knowledge. And yet it's funny because the moment they gained that knowledge, they realized that they were naked, right? And God's like sort of confused in the Bible, right? He's like, well, he's placating them by being quote, quote, confused. He's like, hey, wait a second. How do you know that you're naked? How do you know that you're naked? So there is something phenomenal in the fact that you could say, finally, we're realizing that we're naked. But it's this realization that we're naked is what actually keeps us sustaining and striving. And I think that's what's different between like Al-Halal's perfect monotheist or the martyrdom of Satan. Because I think that's where a lot of that's the covering up of weakness, honestly. The sort of this achieving of perfect monotheist, of this certainty of what is. Whereas man himself, with his vulnerabilities, being made to toil and everything, this is like such a tragic thing for us, apparently. But it's actually like the most beautiful thing that we can ever come to realize in the end of all events. But yeah, leave it there.
So I think it's interesting discussion going on, actually, and I was thinking that how to think about this question in some senses, and I think one of the things that we can say about weakness is that weakness actually has a representationalist trap into it. It's a representation that emerges from our own calculable mind. That weakness is actually something that you calculate. That this is something which is not a weakness and this is weakness. It is something which is coming from human capacity to calculate in a given situation. It's never outside that calculation, which is why vulnerability as a word emerges when that calculation is suspended. It is then you can be vulnerable in the true sense of the word. If you are constantly calculating what is it that is going to make me weak, or what is it that makes me weak that I have to protect myself against, you can't be vulnerable there. There is something about that profit and loss statement that we make for ourselves, that strength and weakness dichotomy that we draw for ourselves, that immediately bars us from our own creative potential. There is something about it which we need to think about, that weakness as a representation only comes to us within a certain matrix of calculation, in some senses. And I think if we start thinking about this matrix seriously, this matrix can be helpful to us in some situations. Let's be honest about it. I don't think the question is simply about which weakness is which good and which weakness is bad. It's not that simple either. My lungs failing can be a good and a bad thing, both in different contexts. It's a question of what is the use of that matrix for us as human beings, and at what point that matrix completely failed us. And it does fail us more often than not. More often than not, vulnerability is a great thing to have, because it helps you locate yourself in the world without this direct matrix of or this simple calculation of what you can actually extract from the situation. And then I think most religion actually saw God's grace within that matrix of within this space of vulnerability than this matrix of profit and loss. This profit and loss might have been important for us for our survival, like most narcissistic tendencies are. They help you survive, But beyond that, people saw that for any higher faculties to open up to you for yourself, you need vulnerability. And I think Pramachi's story was a brilliant one, Daniel, that actually really captures it. That human beings actually are human because they can have some kind of direct contact with their own vulnerability. Because for them, their own vulnerability is their strength. Their biggest strength. They can be vulnerable in that sense and work through it and be it and so on and so forth.
No, beautifully well put. And it makes me think of, there are some individuals who get brain injuries and the part of them that fears no longer works. And it's actually terrible because they're not able to discern, what they should do, when they should cross the road because they don't have any fear. And it's actually very bad. And it makes me think of Daniel Pink's idea of this kind of form of regret. Like, yes, he's not saying that you want to live a life of regret. What he's saying is that regret, the possibility of regret, can help decision making, right? And so likewise, weakness and the possibility of failure can help decision making. It would make you say, the very fact that you say, wait a minute, my brain is very vulnerable to self-deception. I better go talk with people who disagree with me, right? Like that can help push you into relationship precisely because you acknowledge that your brain is in the business, not really of truth, but of making you feel right in survival, right? So that acknowledgement actually pushes you to a place where the weakness then motivates a improvement, not ever a overcoming it, but a kind of sublation in a Hegelian sense, where you're always moving to another place where you'll mess up, but you'll mess up better and you'll die better in per se. On the Sufi story, it's very interesting when Iblis is like, we're made of fire, man's made of clay. There is a way to read that where Iblis is denying uncertainty, because if Allah can say things that kind of deny or go against kind of the set board of how things are, then there's a kind of, you have to be open. You can't assume how things are going to be because Allah could make humans and then say angels have to serve them. So there's a way in which you could read that where precisely Iblis's true monotheism is a denial of uncertainty. Because it's like, and so there's a reading of that that's interesting. And another thing I was going to say is there's a sense in which in the Garden of Eden, you have, Adam, because it's just Adam, before the fall, it's just Adam, man and woman. It's not Adam and Eve. The separation of the name and thus essence comes after the fall. I think that's very important. But anyway, the man and woman are naked, but they're not ashamed. But after the fall, they're ashamed of their nakedness, which in a way means they become ashamed of their weakness, of which is the prerequisite for paradise, per se. Because in a way, like if I were to say, hey guys, let's go out in the middle of public and be naked, that would be hell, right? Like if you were thrown in a public arena naked, it would feel like hell. The shame would be so overwhelming that it would crush you. And some people even will just define hell as being in God's presence and ashamed of God, right? Like hell is to be in God's presence and ashamed of God or to hate God. And you're so overwhelmed by the shame of rejecting God that turns into hell, right? So there's that kind of idea that hell results in a disordered relationship to God once you're in his presence, because then it overwhelms you. Well, likewise, there's almost a way in which nakedness is that transformation. There is nakedness when you're not ashamed of your weakness, and therefore it's actually heaven or Eden, but then nakedness after the fall becomes hell. In the same way that, God that you're not ashamed of becomes heaven, and then being in God's presence when you're ashamed of him becomes hell. So it's interesting to see nakedness as actually having a similar potential function as that. Because like basically all of, and Nietzsche talks about this in book 5 of The Gay Science, because I've been going through every section of that because I'm an idiot and my paper's way too long for the anthology that's due in 10 days. Nietzsche talks about all of European morality, European culture being a way to hide our nakedness. And basically Nietzsche's almost purporting when he's talking about the overman, a kind of nakedness. And now, of course, he's thinking Hercules and Apollo and the Greeks and Homers and different things. But he even will talk about nakedness as a kind of hell in all of European culture doing everything in its power to hide it, when he's like, no, we need to overcome that shame and actually, quote unquote, be naked, which for him would be to live according to your own values, not fall into mass thinking, herd mentality, et cetera, so forth. And so it's interesting to think of philosophy, and then I'll pass it to whoever wants to speak. Philosophy as being in the business of one, being able to discern what are the things you are afraid of, so you can give into that, tension relativity that Javier talks about and push into, so that you are able to face your fear and to be courageous and move toward, quote unquote, nakedness in the sense of vulnerability, when ironically, all of modern culture often is saying, how do you plan to avoid nakedness, avoid weakness, which in what we are describing would actually in some respects be the exact opposite. And in some ways, perhaps one, if we take, Vervaeke's meaning crisis, and I know we've talked about problems with that language, but generally, if the meaning crisis is where increasingly more and more people are being forced to confront the inevitability of weakness, when their entire way of life has been planning to avoid weakness, and that creates a pathological situation where then you're overwhelmed, well, then we need to see philosophy as coming to terms with that reality, and then the dance and art of what it means to live that way. And that's a transformation in how we think about philosophy and thinking in general. And the last thing I'll say too on your point there, Chetan, is since there are situations where a failing kidney might be a good thing, and since we can't just have universal principle of what's bad and what's good, the philosopher must always be awake. You always must be discerning of every particular situation and paying attention to the variables that are at play in making a judgment every single time, which of course is very difficult. How much nicer would it be to be able to say 2 + 2 = 4 and be done with it, have a universal answer that always applies? But instead, we have to discern in our own particular situations what is the case, which then could result in you almost by definition having to step outside the Nietzschean herd mentality, because the herd mentality is often defined by a universal answer or a universal non-contingent notion that you always follow, which of course the danger of that is you end up in Hannah Arden's banality of evil, where everyone is just thoughtlessly ascribing to the solution, and that actually leads to something totalitarian. So that being awake, which then, and I'll pass it to Javier, gets us into the dance that we've been describing, the dance of knowing when to step in, when to step out. Sometimes stepping on the dance floor might be egotistical and bad, but other times it might be what you need to do because you're afraid to step on the dance floor, right? Same action, but based on different situations, based on your different conditionality, it can transform what you need to do versus not. What you shouldn't do. So I think that changes the calculus quite a bit. But let me give it to Javier.
I'm just saying, for that being alive, you need to have some touch with your own vulnerability. So there is that paradox there.
Absolutely.
Yeah, Javier, please.
Yeah. So this actually reminds me why I'm always critical of. I'm always making fun of the trolley problem that philosophy has obsessed over for centuries, and yet, ironically enough, I've thought of another problem that is more. In reality, it happens in life all the time, but the philosophy of it is amazing in terms of. So when I go to class, we always have to cross this certain street, and it's a super busy street because students are always crossing it, and cars have to wait. But what I've noticed, and this kind of goes in with Chetan's point about this idea of calculating weakness, what you can tell becomes very problematic is when somebody suddenly stops and wants to create an opening for the cars to go through. The problem is most people crossing don't want to do that. They want to keep passing, right? So you get this weird tension where there's a group of people waiting to let the cars go, and then you got these other people that are just keep passing. They don't care, right? Now, what's fascinating about this is that actually, in my opinion, the way to cross the street is not to create the opening, but to simply wait for the natural opening to which you are allowed to cross. And the same thing with the cars. What becomes problematic is when we both try to create the openings and neither know when to go, right? So there is something very rhythmic about the way in which weakness is a sort of like timing in terms of an opening that we must take when it avails itself to us. And I think this is what I think Chetan is trying to get at for us, because this is not something that we can calculate, but we have to have the courage to take it when it arrives. And then part of my philosophy of timing is when we don't have the courage to take it, we take that failure, we subvert that failure as a part of the act itself. Meaning, like, if you fail at an improv act, right, and people are like, oh, that was horrible timing for you to even do that. The funny thing about that is that you sort of play along with it, right? You don't let the failure sort of stop the act itself, or stop the whole comedy skit. You keep going with the act. In fact, you try to make it as if it was a part of the act, right? Like, yeah, I meant to do that, you know. So I think that's why in my relation to the philosophy of timing is that we take responsibility for our when we decided to do it or not do it. And when we do that, we can subvert tragedy. And it's funny because only human beings can do this. We're the only ones that can take tragedy into a comic tragedy. And it's funny because time has this lovable thing where we can laugh about it later, right? But it's amount of time. It takes time for the joke to manifest. And that is what we're waiting for half the time. And this is very Nietzschean, in my opinion, having the courage to laugh. But yeah, that's it.
It seems like you can get at what weakness is trying to provide with something like sensitivity or receptivity. And it's almost as if you have that openness, then it's actually much less likely that the weakness is going to catch you off guard. And you probably still need a type of weakness to realize your finitude. But beyond that, it seems like all weakness is doing is reminding you to remain open. It's sort of like in the case of timing, like when you're crossing the road, there are these energies that are flowing. And if you try to calculate when to step out, the chances are it will work in one moment, but it won't work in the next. Whereas if you have this sensitivity and this receptivity, you're kind of feeling into the world, feeling into these flows and sort of sensing the critical mass that's arising where the gap opens up, and then everyone can step through.
No, I really like that. And an overall, I like this idea that it's most like timing, rhythm, sensitivity. I mean, a lot of what we've discussed through the net has been escaping this kind of metaphoric structure of like even weakness versus power, although we know what we mean by that, or right versus wrong. But there's so much where it seems like artistic metaphors or more accurate, like Javier mentioned the improv, and it's true. Like in improv, I'm great friends with does improv comedy. Well, when he lived in New York, he would do it, and he would always say, "You don't fail until you stop." Like as long as you don't stop, you don't fail. And you always and he says that sounds so easy, but of course it's very difficult because when you as an improv person do a joke and nobody laughs, it's really hard not to have the failure of the audience respond not throw you off. Like you literally have to kind of ignore the fact that the audience didn't laugh, or your brain shuts down and you can't come up with the next joke. And so there's actually, it's almost like a point is that in that moment when the audience doesn't laugh, which seems to be the peak example of failure, is one of the great accomplishments of the improv comedian to keep going through that. Like right in that moment of failure, he didn't make them laugh. That's when the skill, that's when you can tell you're dealing with a truly great improv comedian, precisely because the lack of laughter from the audience doesn't throw them off. And that's what's really hard. It's really easy to keep going if you've got an audience that gets your jokes and blah, blah, blah. But it's when you hit that wall of an audience that doesn't get you, it's very difficult to stay in the headspace of the comedian, because basically as an improv comedian, you have to be a kind of method actor in a sense, right? You have to be in the world of the joke and keep it going and keep it going. And I do think that's Nietzschean in the sense of like when you run into people who aren't, say, getting the values you're creating or not understanding why you're living the life you're living or doing what you're doing, they don't throw you out of your headspace, right? And you're able to then stay in the headspace. And if you lose that headspace, you're not going to be able to maintain the timing. You're not going to be able to see when you should walk into the crowd because you're not going to be in the headspace to know when you should enter the dance and when you shouldn't enter the dance. So all of these things go together to kind of suggest that the life of philosophy is a lot more similar to the life of the artist or certain artists, the jazz improvisationist, certain dancing, and that therefore you need an entirely different metaphoric structure by which to think of it, like timing, like rhythm, like sensitivity, like discerning. All of these different things become a different way to think about it, as opposed to true, false, yes, no, binary answers. And that's where Derrida, I think, is very valuable. That was the correct approach to deconstruction that then perhaps was transformed once you get into thinkers like Pierre Desmond or different things. And that also gets into Caputo. With that, I'll pass it to whoever would like to speak.
I would sort of go back to this question of shame that you were raising over there. And there's something extremely interesting about shame, I think, which would connect back to this discussion in a sort of divergent way, I think. But shame is a very interesting thing, because when we are ashamed of something, we realize that accepting that thing about ourselves, as you said, if you throw yourself naked into a crowd, what would actually happen? Nobody's going to kill you in that sense. But there is a point at which your complete world breaks down, which has no rational basis for it to happen. There is something about shame which is extremely curious in that sense, that you cannot have immediate good reasons for it to be that bad in that sense. You may poke your nose, you may scratch your butt, whatever. There is no reason for your whole world to be falling apart from something of that nature. It may be embarrassing, that's a different issue, but that is not how shame works, essentially. And if you start thinking about it, even if they take the Adam and Eve story, if I remember correctly, I think Augustine was the person who said, there was sex in heaven in that sense, in the garden, but the sex was like the way you move your hand in that sense. Sex became sex. This anxiety with sexuality actually emerged with the fall in that sense. And it is in that sense, with the fall, human beings became not only alienated only from the outside, but from the inside itself. That is where you have to place this question of the unconscious at the heart of it. And if you start thinking about this question of the unconscious, and you think about this question of repression is exactly that point of shame. Repression is that repressed impulse that cannot be assimilated back into your consciousness. And it's extremely hard for us to assimilate what we have repressed within us, for whatever reasons, but human beings have an extremely strange relationship, not just with the outside, but with their own insides. That cut with the inside is extremely important for human beings to have an outside in that sense. And how do we structure that? And I think the Prometheus myth actually goes back to this question of weakness of the human being, of this vulnerability of the human being, is precisely the point, because human beings are cut in that very radical way from the inside itself. That is the point of vulnerability. That is where we are thrown into the world of language. That is the only thing we have, because we cannot have any other clause or any of the other things in that sense. Thus, we have only this world of language through which we can create something. And the other side of that is, of course, technology. We can create things that others can't. I think there's something to that story which can be interesting to think about. Yeah.
Well, no, I'll just add to that. I mean, it's if human beings say we're just forced along a certain path, kind of determined, like pushed by cause and effect, it really wouldn't be anything to be afraid of, even if you were being pushed toward a volcano, because, you can't really avoid it, right? It's precisely that human beings are able to do things differently. To some degree, one would have to get into the discussion of total free will or relative free will and all that fun jazz, which is a great conversation. But anyway, there's a certain fact that the very fact that a human being seems to have some ability to shape the direction they go in, that then creates this entire this entire kind of terror of where you end up, what people will think about those choices. And then why would you freely choose to go into weakness? There's something about that is inherently irrational. Like, why would you choose to take your armor off in the Prometheus? Why would you choose to be naked and vulnerable? There's something, this is, I think, this is why for me the category of non-rational is so important. You have irrational, rational, and non-rational. And I think it's really destroyed the modern mind to only have irrational or rational. Therefore, everything that's not rational is irrational, and therefore you shouldn't do it. Well, if indeed there's something about vulnerability that is optimal for the human, then that would in a way be irrational, but actually it's non-rational. It's something that cannot be understood in rational thinking until it is done, until you see the fruits that come from the vulnerability, but maybe not all at once. Maybe you have 3 months where it seems like a stupid idea and you have to go through with it, right? And this is where too, I always bring up like the Nash equilibrium in game theory. A Nash equilibrium is when you get a suboptimal result because everyone does what's rational, right? Like, if everyone in the game theory does what is rational, you get a suboptimal result. What's very interesting is in this context, you see how weakness, of which is non-rational, is actually how you get an optimal result. But if you don't have the category of non-rational, then you just end up in suboptimal results or the irrational that then you're not going to do because you don't want to be irrational. Aren't you smart? Didn't you go to college or something like that? And so it is. So this is the other thing where another reason why, and then I'll pass it to whoever wants to speak, it would seem that philosophy really does need to understand itself more in aesthetic and artistic metaphors, is because it's clearer that the creative act cannot be reduced to mere rationality. Like, is writing War and Peace rational? Is creating a work of art or creating a community, is that rational? It doesn't really fit. That language doesn't really fit. It's like you do it. It's like you believe in it. You start entering into more of a language of you believe in, you have faith in, you have the courage to try. Like rational or irrational doesn't quite capture it. It's more non-rational and gets more into, dare I say, personal spiritual resources of an individual doing something that they think to believe in. But if philosophy is divorced from aesthetic thinking, then it's going to only be operating in the realm of, say, rational, irrational, true, false, and you're not even going to bring in all of those dimensions that you see the artistic act or the phenomenology of the artist, as I'll talk about with Mr. Luber, gets into, which then is about the courage, the facing of weakness, the discernment and things of that nature. But with that, I'll pass it to whoever would like to speak.
One thing briefly on rationality. Yeah, I guess there's a normative definition, which is something like cognitive, rational thinking, somewhere above the shoulders and largely free of emotion. And then there's what I received from John Vervaeke when he talks about rationality. He breaks it down to ratio, and something about proportionality comes through in that. And so what are you proportional to? Is your hand proportional to the apple? Something like that. So then if we take that to be the case, it's about what are you in conformity with? And so what seems to be completely irrational from one standpoint is totally rational from another, because you're conforming to different value systems in some way. If you're making a choice out of love, for example, that could look incredibly irrational, but it could be rational in the sense that you're conforming yourself with that high value, and that also could be an intuition move. You're conforming yourself to your artistic muse or something like that, and that doesn't. It's rational, but it's in conformity with a different plane or even a different timeline, where you can't, if you conform yourself to love, and then, as you say, that proves to be a disaster for some period of time, it might well be something else in a longer period of time.
No, that's an excellent comment. And, when you go back to like your Augustines or some of your more classical thinkers, they would always kind of talk about different epistemological categories, like a proportion, like weight. Judgment would not merely be like a, labeling, but a kind of ordering. Like rationality was in the business of a certain ordering in different things. And Vervaeke, exactly what you're saying. He'll talk about rationality in the context of phenomenologists like Ponnier and Gibbons, I can't think, where it's like the grip, like when you have the right grip on it, the right way to hold things in different things. And certainly the trick is once you understand that, say, weakness has the ability of opening up human beings to community, and they're not fully human until they do that, well, suddenly it's rational to do that. Like rationality suddenly, once it gets that premise, it transforms what constitutes rational for the individual. And that's kind of in the paper, or the name of the trilogy is The True Isn't the Rational. What we believe is rational is always relative to what we believe is true. The issue is that rationality comes after truth, and how do you determine what is true? And it's going to have something to do with what you think is rational, but then it gets into experience, it gets into emotions, it gets to the places you put your conditionality and different things like that. But the moment you think about what you believe is true, that then organizes your rationality to make it seem it was always just rational, that it had nothing to do with other ways of knowing, because the moment you interpret what you believe is true, you do it in logical, you do it through your brain. So your brain is going to understand it in terms of thought. So there's always this very quick consuming of what you believe is true by rationality to make it seem as if it was always rationality. And basically what we're critiquing here, Jacob, and I should be clearer, is autonomous rationality, which is the notion that the only way human beings know things is through rationality, and that rationality is the only way by which to structure the world. And then when you get into thinkers like David Hume and the Scottish Enlightenment, the problem with that is that it basically leads to totalitarianism. If you follow like the Adorno, Horkheim, the dialectics of enlightenment, and then that would even be the Heideggerian technological thought, where you can understand everything just with rationality. But of course, rationality to itself, and then I'll pass it to Chetan, has to operate according to universals, generalities, non-contingency, things that apply in all situations, but that would remove the human element. That would remove all of that, would lead you in the direction of not thinking about philosophy in terms of the art or timing. It would come to just knowing the universal truths. And if everyone knew the universal truths, everything would be better. And so that kind of tradition of the Enlightenment, which I know Vervaeke critiques, Vervaeke, that's an excellent thinker to bring in, because he's indeed, I think some people will even talk about trans rationality. They'll talk about like higher stack rationality and different things. So certainly the word rationality can be used to refer to a more holistic way of thinking. I guess in my work tend to talk about the true versus the rational, because most people in the West, their understanding of rationality is going to be following from the tradition of the Enlightenment. It's going to be following from universal non-contingent thought. Whereas once you move into someone like Vervaeke, and you're talking about a rationality that has then incorporated into itself its need to be embodied. Like he was talking about going to that like rock climbing in one of his talks recently, and the need to do these kind of physical activities, and how your understanding of the world is then informed by that. Well, then, yeah, your rationality would transform. So no, I think it was a great comment.
I just wanted to sort of continue the discussion on rationality and weakness. Sort of just to put it in that sense, if you think about reason as this, and this essentially reason and understanding, as Kant puts it, which is that reason is a synthetic category, understanding is an analytic category in the Kantian thinking, which basically means that reason helps us give certain statements about the world which cannot be solely figured out through logic. It is saying something about the world, and some information from the world is required to recognize its truth value. But analytic statements can be only figured out through logic. That's the distinction. And if we start thinking, and if we go back to a discussion that we were having with vulnerability is something which has to engage with synthetic values. That is where you cannot calculate it. Its truth value will only emerge when what is it saying about the world is taken into account, which cannot be predicted in advance. Whereas and in many senses, rationality is a struggle with the synthetic roots of reason. Rationality itself as a category emerges from the struggle for reason to be not synthetic. Sometimes that struggle can go either ways. I'm not saying rationality always becomes, in some senses, some kind of a doomed, And analytic things have its own value in many ways. But rationality is always at odds with its own character or its own nature. I think Lacan, one of his essays, said it very nicely about truth, and I think it's sort of that truth in its phenomenological essence, is always alien to the order of science. in many ways, that science always wants to claim on truth. But if we see how human beings use truth in their daily lives, in their spiritual, religious, different pursuits, scientific truth is very alien to it. In fact, if you think about this question of cause and effect, in fact, very idea of cause and effect in the human world emerges because there's a certain failure between cause and effect. If cause and effect was built without a failure together, it would have been just a natural law. It didn't need to be called a cause and effect. Cause and effect have a failure of their own built into it. That is where we can recognize it as a cause, because something else could have happened over there. Otherwise it becomes a physical law in that sense, the Newton's laws, and so those kind of things. So there is something about reason itself as a category that emerges, with its own struggle, with the outside in some senses, where this vulnerability has always got a role to play. And when we try and factor that out, we somewhere morph or mutate human relationship with truth itself, where truth itself then becomes this very fixed, mutated category in some sense. And how do we think through it?
There's a way in which one can go rationality plus truth equals reason. And there's a lot of thinkers who have different languages for it, and that's where it gets tricky. What I will say on the point that you were saying with science, Nietzsche is very interesting on science, because in the second section of book 5, and then somewhere around 372-3 section of the Gay Science, he says something along the lines of, if you think that the scientific explanation is the fullest explanation, you're an idiot, is what he basically says. Like, the scientific explanation of how things occur is nowhere even close to the fullest explanation for the human being for how things go. And what he actually says is that people in his age are using science to escape the human element and facing the human. And they're using that to run from their own weakness, frankly. But they do it in a manner, he says he's very critical of it, because it's like they act humble. It's like, well, hey, guys, it's just the truth. That's what the science says. It's not me. It's just what the science says. I wish I could do something else, but we have to do it. And he's like posing it as a way that people are using to flee and to escape, in the same way that he critiques religion, but he critiques society, and he even critiques, like he talks about everything he's doing as a kind of aesthetic move, but then he critiques artists, like the art culture, as being a way to escape. So everything in Nietzsche has a contingency to it, right? It just depends on the mode. But let me give it to Javier.
Because going back to shame and what Chetan was saying, and bringing up Derrida again, it makes me think that actually, when we talk about weakness, it seems like our duty seems to be those that sort of create or play with language, into which we can provoke, not being antagonistic, because I think I recently watched a talk by Adam Phillips on psychoanalysis and where he thinks it should go, but in being welcoming and showing the sort of weakness. And so I started thinking, like, if you think about like hospital, nurses play a very interesting role in like sort of catering between showing your weakness, right? You come, you say you're sick and everything else, but there is something about that sort of being there, sort of revealing and mending and showing the weakness to the being. So I started thinking of this word calling, being hospitable. We have to create a language that is hospitable to allow people to see a weakness that isn't necessarily calculable, right? Because it's already there, but we have to find some type of language, and I think this is relative to every person in this case. Without necessarily being antagonistic, because the thing about being antagonistic is that may not always work, right? Being antagonistic towards somebody's weakness, or them trying to reveal to them a kind of weakness, is something that can also prevent them from wanting to even acknowledge that weakness in the first place. So that kind of antagonism is something that I'm always hesitant about, but there's still a way that we can play with language to where we welcome, be hospitable to the weakness that is hidden for the person. And I think philosophy and poetry and a lot of the artistic elements give us those tools to do that. And I think psychoanalysis, same thing, give us those tools to sort of help and be hospitable to each other as beings, to you know, hold and see a weakness that we did not see before. But it is with this language, this playing of language, that I think is like very important about how we be hospitable to each other's weakness and sort of help each other see. And I think, you know, the doubting Thomas story, I think it's like a perfect example of this, right? Jesus sort of like, he doesn't get mad at Thomas for doubting his, you know, doubting his wounds. He's like, yeah, come, feel, touch, go ahead. You know, he's being hospitable to his doubting, and seeing. So yeah.
It makes me think of also that kind of begs the question of, hey, Michelle, hi. That makes me think of kind of the idea of what does it mean also to, how should we respond to weakness? You know, you almost in like the culture today, if you see weakness, people attack. It's kind of the political structure. Oh, weakness, go in and attack. Whereas the correct response to weakness is not to even see it as weakness, but an opening for relationship. And it's funny, though, how we almost, Dimitri, good to see you. So it almost seems very natural, though, that we like to be hospitable to non-needy people or strong people because we don't have to worry about like over-attachment and getting pulled into something. So we don't mind that. Like we don't mind inviting the Pharisees and Sadducees over, but when you start talking about, you know, inviting the sinner over or the person with pathology, nah, that's okay. I don't want that. Now, at the same time, there's something to be said. It's always contingent. There's toxic individuals that you invite into your life that have a kind of problematic neediness that is a result of a deficiency, and they're just kind of trying to pull you in, and it's not good. I mean, but that's where you gotta, you know, Jesus does say in the gospel, there are times where you kick the dust off of your shoe and you walk away. That's very important. But that, of course, requires a discernment to discern, you know, are you running from weakness or are you too weak to face a toxic individual? That can be a kind of fear where you go, I'm afraid to like kick this, you know, to walk away from this person because they're toxic when I know I should. So it can go either way. But it's interesting to think on hospitality, and I like how you connected that with nurse in terms of a response to weakness. But with that, I'll give it to Michelle. Michelle, good to see you.
Thank you, guys. Good to see you all. And I'm glad the internet's not crashing. That's good. So yeah, I really love the things that you guys are bringing up. And I love that the language play there, Javier, with hospitable. And it makes me think too, like, about the fact that, like, if there's somebody, you know, let's just say Susie, and she's like, yeah, I've been in the hospital, you know, every day for the past, you know, 3 years. And it's like, oh my gosh, like, it's like, yeah, I'm a nurse. Like I'm like a nurse and a patient are both in the hospital, right? Like they're actually both in the hospital. And it's kind of interesting to think about that because it kind of, it concedes that there's like this commonality or like there's something that they both have to be in this, I don't know if what I call a condition or place or something like that where the healing happens, right? Where if we want to say that, like, obviously there are other forms beyond the hospital, but let's just use it as like a symbol for healing. And I think that is interesting to me because I was like, oh, that's funny, I've never thought about that. Like, and I know they're there for different reasons, right? But like both the nurse and the patient are in the hospital, you know, they're in the hospital. We usually associate that with like, oh, like, is everything okay? Why are you in the hospital? You know? And then the other thing I was thinking about word wise, it's just funny because you have to be able to be, you have to be patient, you know, you have to be a patient. You have to be a patient to be able to like acknowledge that you are in a hospital it's like interesting to think about the connections there with being patient, being hospitable, needing healing, but also being able to offer recovery and offer healing. And so there seems to be this sort of like reciprocal nature where we sort of see that it's not just like, oh, these people need help and they're in the hospital. It's like, I'm in the hospital too, you know, like I also am sort of like, there's this reciprocity of healing and learning that occurs for the nurse and the patient or the nurse and the patients. So I thought that was kind of interesting. And I wanted to touch on really quick, this will tie in, I promise, but basically the idea of like the stand-up comedian who is like I never thought about that, how sometimes, like to your point, Daniel, that they have to ignore, basically they have to like ignore, they just straight ignore whatever the audience is doing. And that's really interesting to me, because I typically think of like responding as kind of gauging like, oh, okay, they're not laughing, so like now I'm gonna do something different. But for the stand-up comedian, it's like, oh, they're not laughing, I'm just gonna like, I'm not gonna let that bother me. I'm going to basically ignore the fact that that joke didn't go over so well. I'm gonna keep joking, like I'm gonna keep this performance alive, and I'm gonna keep it going. And it got me thinking about like this thought I've been having, or question I've been having in my head recently about like lying, basically, because I'm just like, is he lying to himself? Like there's a strange sort of place of like a I know that like the risk is like, oh well, we complexify these things so much, then we'll never know like right from wrong or whatever. But it's like there is a way in which I think there is a complexity to lying that is very interesting to me, and important, because for example, the comedian almost has to like lie to himself that like he's good enough, even though clearly like in that joke, that particular joke and reaction of the audience would prove he's like not doing a good job, right? He's not, doing good at his stand-up, right? So he has to sort of like not lie to himself, but almost like ignore what's going on and continue doing what he's doing. And then, yeah, if he doesn't stop, like, the hope is that everyone's going to start like raving and laughing and, enjoying it. But there's this sort of like strange sort of question I have there about discerning reality, truth, and then also the concept of lying related to this idea of responding. And I guess the only way that I can kind of make sense of it is that response is like more, what are you choosing to be responsible to? And so the consistency is not in how you respond, because then it actually just becomes reaction. But it's more that your consistency is to what you're responsible for, like and that will gear your response. And so his job in that moment is to be responsible for being a stand-up comedian and being funny and trying. And so I don't know, it's just like brought up some questions for me on that. But it does also like, okay, last thing, back to the point about like, calling out people's weakness and stuff. I think that the reason why people can get aggressive with that, or seemingly aggressive, is because people feel like, well, I just don't want to condone it. If I don't call it out, if I don't like make them very aware of their weakness, then I'm just condoning it, And I hear that, and I understand that on a very basic level that makes sense. But yet I just feel like I see that crash and burn. Like it just, and it's so opposing to some of the like Desert Father teaching, where like, a Desert Father monk has his book stolen that he spent 5 years transcribing, himself, and then some man steals it, then he goes to the market, the monk, and realizes that his book's being sold. And the man's like, yeah, that guy, like, he's trying to make a profit off your book. And then the monk says like, oh, thank you for letting me know. He doesn't like reprimand it. He says that should be actually, you should charge twice as much as for that book. And I'm not going to get it back. He's like, so basically he doesn't call out the man who stole it at all. He actually like says like, you're right to have taken it and charged money for it. Actually charge more for it so you can get more for yourself. And like in this simple act of like, it's like, it's so convicting to the man who stole the book that he like repented, came back, like returned the book to the monk. Sorry, I didn't tell that story right, but I hope you got the gist of it. And like, then he ended up just like giving, basically becoming a monk himself. It was like such a crazy story. One of my favorites, but like, yeah, it just, to me, that's like so powerful, right? Because even the Christian thing to do, or like the religious thing would be like, you lied, that's wrong, that's bad, you should repent. And like, I see how that works, but then I also see how that sometimes backfires. And so I really am interested in this whole idea of the monk basically is like, I don't actually have to do the work of calling him out, because his own, like, if I do it, it will actually it'll backfire. But if I allow it to just take its course, that man will actually come to terms with it too. And even if he doesn't, it's not my problem. It's not my problem, So I'm just, these are some thoughts that came to mind. Thanks for letting me share. And thank you all for being here. So yeah.
No, that's excellent. I'll pass it to Dimitri. I think, a few things. One, on the comedian example, there's the risk of giving into self-deception, but you have to, in a way, have the courage to face the possibility of self-deceiving yourself. But then if you really are self-deceiving yourself, you shouldn't do that, right? And so then this is where philosophy always has to have this live discernment of the live situation, of which requires having the internal resources to know maybe in some situations you should call the guy out as stealing, as lying, but then in other situations you should not. And that's where it seems like philosophy has a lot more to do with an art form, with timing, with not impulsively reacting with what you think is the right thing to do, but instead discerning it quickly, phenomenologically examining it, empiric, one has to get into those terms to determine what one should do. And if I were to say, again, what one of the things Nietzsche wants to get out with Beyond Good and Evil is good and evil are too often used as universal categories to remove from you the discernment of what you need to do in that situation. He's not saying not to have ethical or right life at all, but to walk away from, to be careful of ethics of which remove active embodied discernment in the situation. And yeah, because like what you're saying, the comedian, there's a way in which you say, oh, the audience isn't laughing because this is not a good joke, and you change. But then there's the discernment of saying the audience isn't laughing, but I need to ignore that to maintain the world that I am in because it's a good world. But then you have to have the internal resource to judge that the joke you are telling is a good joke and that you shouldn't change it. But that's when you should step into confidence. But maybe in another situation, you step into humility and acknowledge that the joke you're telling is not good, so you pivot. Well, that's all active. That's all alive. That's all that. And that I get, when I hear people talk about trans rationality or some of the work, Jacob was bringing up Vervaeke, which was excellent, is that live, you're climbing the rock mountain, you're going into, I think he talks about serious play is another thing that Vervaeke will talk about, like having all of that being a kind of training ground of a way of thinking that is not disembodied enlightenment, autonomous rationality. But let me pass it with Dimitri. Dimitri, good to see you, sir.
Yeah, good to see you guys as well. I've been working on the Nietzsche paper, and one of the themes, that's one of the central themes there is shame. And I was totally shocked when I was researching shame, and I was reading some Zizek, of course, what else? And he says he's talking about the fall from paradise explicitly. He says it was the moral feeling of shame that itself made them guilty. So it's not first we are guilty, then we feel ashamed. No, first we feel ashamed, our face becomes red, we feel horrible. And that retroactively establishes a kind of virtual guilt, deemed by the big other, of course. So this is a very interesting gesture, right? Because especially in regards to embodiment, because shame is a very embodied thing. You feel it in your entire body when you really feel ashamed, like, oh shit, these people are looking at me, they have their eyes on me. But still you can supersede shame, you don't have to be stuck in it. Of course, we can never completely get rid of shame except for Nietzsche's spirit child. But that's a big topic. So in Sex and the Field Absolute, Zizek distinguishes 4 kinds of modes of a relation to language. Now, the first one is just praxis. It's just like, hey, what are we gonna eat tonight? Yeah, I'm gonna get this at the grocery store. Okay, fine, cool. What did you do for work today? It was great. And this is, he says basically this is one way to disavow the cut of the subject. Another way is what Lacan calls la langue. And this is kind of like, Charlie Chaplin has this movie where there's kind of a Hitler figure having this speech, and it's pure gibberish, it's pure voice, it's nothing. This is another way to disavow the cut. It's what Freud kind of called the Lust-Ich. It's cut in like a circle, and it's just playfulness. So the third one is language, as a kind of meta-language that steps outside of subjectivity and takes an objective, neutral third position. It disavows the cut. That's what it does, simply. And the fourth mode of relation to language, this is the traumatic one, because the subject as such is trauma. And I think this is very important to take into account. It's not just like, hey, yeah, we got to take the subject into account, and once we create a language for that, it'll all be fine. So in this fourth mode of relation to language, it can include philosophy. Take Hegel, Heidegger, Kierkegaard. It can include, psychoanalysis, of course, poetry, and especially poetry, anxious poetry that attempts to make palatable the cut in some kind of desperation. And mysticism, funnily enough, Zizek actually mentions mysticism itself. So the thing with like modes of language that actually do not disavow the subject is that our entire relation to reality is in danger and will change when we render this palatable, when we actually look at the wound for what it is. I think about this so often that Lacan said that whenever people meet and they really have an authentic and intimate conversation, that will change the nature of all the people involved. So that's that's also, I guess, a means to like intersubjectively mediate the cut and making it palatable. Not only like I think philosophy is a kind of theoretical psychoanalysis that you're doing with yourself if you are working with the cut and not just being a Bertrand Russell who just demonizes Hegel and stuff like this. But yeah, like psychoanalytical spaces too.
No, it's a beautiful comment. A few things with that. Nietzsche will also, again, in the same way, Chitan, you're a beautiful soul. Thank you for being here. And he'll even, in the same way that there's a good science, there's a bad science. There's a good philosophy, there's a bad philosophy. There's a philosophy that is a form of escapism. And as you know, like in the presentation, I want to say that Nietzsche is deconstructing all bestowcentrism, all bestowing, as opposed to an internal becoming in different things. One of the reasons why it seems like philosophy is inescapable is precisely because it does, in fact, impact how you think about the cut, how you think about the wound, how you think about vulnerability, and you're always already in ideas that are shaping your thought. Ideas are practically eyes, is a piece in thoughts. And by not intentionally thinking about philosophy, the problem is you are going to have a way of thinking about the cut. You are going to have a way of interpreting intersubjectivity, and you are going to be influenced by your relationships in your intersubjectivity. And to not be intentional about that might have consequences. And so it is important to be. That's how I ended up in philosophy. It wasn't like I one day woke up and said, man, I'd like to be a philosopher. I saw no way to escape it. I saw no way to get away because philosophy is where you end up if you think long enough. Like if you stop at a certain point, sure, you don't end up there. But if things follow from one to the next, it's where you end up. Now, there are different kinds of philosophy. There are different ways of doing things. We've been talking this whole time about a kind of disembodied problematic philosophy. But once you start talking about this phenomenological aesthetic philosophy, discernment, philosophy of timing and different things, this seems to be very, very necessary. And I think, as hopefully Belonging again makes clear, the more pluralistic, interconnected, and complex the world becomes, it only more so becomes the case because it is not so given on the way that one should carry themselves. Because when you're around similarity, you can just ascribe to the same givens to operate because everyone around you is, say, Christian or Muslim or atheist. And so it is given. But when that is not the case, and therefore you have different intersubjectivities that are influencing you in different ways, there's a lot of secondhand smoke going around that you're breathing in, as Rand talked about, that one wants to be aware of what you're breathing in. So you have to think about those. And if you don't, you're still going to have some mode of interpreting those things. It just may not be the mode you want, but you never took the time to think about to make sure of otherwise. So funny enough, there's a way in which owning weakness makes you vulnerable in ways that are going to sublimate, as opposed to vulnerable in ways that are just going to efface or make you not what you want to be. Like, that even vulnerability has a contingency. You can't say that all weakness, all vulnerability is good. It depends. And funny enough, in the same way that Hume has us leave our common life, go to the ivory tower so that we can return to our common life in a new way and not fall into a Hannah Arendt banality of evil. Likewise, there is a vulnerability here that you start into that's just the vulnerability to, say, the zeitgeist or ideology or just what the people around you think, that you then leave to think about so you're not vulnerable to that. But then you return and embed yourself in the place of those relationships, and you're vulnerable to that. You open yourself up to the people around you, but it's not the same kind of vulnerability. It's a vulnerability that's earned, per se, as opposed to a vulnerability that's just the case because, well, funny enough, because you actually never accepted the vulnerability. That's the funny thing. Like, not ever accepting vulnerability means you're still vulnerable, but in a bad way, a way that leads to effacement, as you know, I like to say, as opposed to one that can have a sublimating angle. But with that, let me give it to Javier, and if anyone else has final things to say.
This is why I kind of like Caputo's notion of God does not exist, but God insists. That this idea, if we look at weakness as a sort of a call, that there is an insistence going on, and our responding, like the way Caputo puts it, our response is our existence. So I really like his play on this idea that there is an insistence going on, and it's about how we respond with our existence that we come into the unknown, the what he calls the perhaps. And you know, God, there's something I was gonna say now, and I just completely just went. But let's see if it comes back. But 'cause I know I want to
Improv.
talk
You got to
a
be the
little bit.
comedian on the stage.
Yeah,
Improv, Javier. Improv.
Oh no, because Dimitri said something about the intersubjectivity. It's coming now. So recently in my Middle Eastern class, we made this subtle distinction between lover and beloved. And what's interesting about the lover is typically they have an unrequited love, which is funny because from the standpoint of the way they look at the beloved, there is no weakness for the beloved, and that's why they're able to sustain this unrequited love. They don't see any weakness. In fact, they see everything that is good that they need to have. And so what's interesting about that is that they cover up the very weakness that would stop them from having this unrequited passion, so to speak. And you can see this actually, and this is why I think Dimitri, when he said that, you know, the subject is trauma, I think this is actually the realm of this interaction, this lover between beloved, where we're having this traumatic, unrequited love, whatever manifestation that may take. Somehow we put something higher than what it was. We chose to see not its weakness, but everything that it could fulfill for us. So it's almost like, in terms of intersubjectivity, what we must do is to sort of reveal that weakness that sustains our unrequited love and yet breaks it, because now finally we can become on the same terms as the beloved and the belover. And so I thought, you know, Dimitri bringing up this point was, you know, fascinating to talk about, because I do think, now with the age of deconstruction and so on, I think we are hinting at, we must leave this notions of our obsession with this unrequited love that we never got satisfied, that we sort of illusion ourselves with certainty that this is in fact what I love, and this is what in fact I know what it is. That for sure I know what it is. But yeah.
Well, I just want to give some appreciation for the insightful contributions from all of you. Really glad that I could come along today. Really taking away Daniel's stress on contingency creeping up on me just as I'm starting to get caught on whatever he's saying. He zings it in there. So I really appreciate that. And also the quality of this conversation has really moved very fluidly between what feels like philosophy and theology in a way that I don't think I've quite experienced before. So I appreciate that too. It's also great to finally meet you, Michelle, after our long Instagram mutual following. So hello. And good to meet all of you guys as well. And I hope that I can come along again at some point.
Great to meet you too, Jacob.
I would just like to have one comment here, because in well, we as subjects self-differentiate, right? We are all thrown into life in different places at different times, and we are all unique in this sense, and that's why oftentimes we don't understand each other and don't want to understand each other. But there's something we have in common, that we're all subjects, that we're all abyssal in our own self-differentiation. And I think that, you know, to like real love is to come to terms with this, and that in you know, to turn around Daniel's language of bestowing to, with the bestowing, bestow yourself in the bestowing, instead of hierarchically be above those who you bestow upon. If you give yourself with the bestowing and have the courage to do that, I think that's how I see love anyway.
Guys, I was really happy to be here. Just want to say that. Thank you all so much. It's just a delight.
No, it's always a complete pleasure. And Jacob, thank you for what you said. Tom, Dimitri, Javier, it's really a delight. Glad to have everyone here. I'm glad our internet didn't crash, Michelle. It really works out, I tell you. Well, a few things come to mind. One, on what you're saying there, Dimitri, certainly the kind of Nietzschean becoming has a sort of self-bestowing in the same way that there is an intrinsic motivation, and love. There's kind of a tragic element. It's interesting, as one advances in Nietzsche, there is a kind of tragic element where, although there's a deconstruction of bestow-centricism, you can't ever totally escape bestowing, but how do the lines come closer to closer? And there's a way very much in which love is a mutual becoming that still has an externality that is trying to work through that to get to a place where, say, the man and the woman are both called Adam, you know, to go back to that Eden. A few more things. C.S. Lewis has this line somewhere where he says something along the following. He says that the road to hell is paved with hearts that never break, while the road to heaven is paved with hearts that break. The road to heaven is paved with broken hearts. And I think that's very true. And there's also an interesting idea that he also makes a note that the reason why eternity is not awfully boring, you know, in his thinking, is because God is an ever deepening mystery. He's never complete. There's always an opening of deeper and deeper experience. And how terrible would it be, Lewis kind of suggests, if one got to heaven and it was done? You had completion. There was no incompleteness. And in that sense, incompleteness, which in finitude is a terrible thing, suddenly becomes a wonderful thing in eternity, because then there's an ever deepening mystery. And frankly, I would argue that basically all the mysticisms, whether it be Sufism, the Kabbalah, you know, Judaism, have a notion of eternity that is like that. It is not this kind of stagnant repetition of an enlightenment or something like that. And basically, it would seem that the name of the game is, if we take that idea of eternity as where incompleteness is precisely why eternity is good, as opposed to an awful boredom that would basically be hell. The way some theologians put it is they'll say hell is timeless while heaven is eternal. Hell is just a repetition of finite time going on and on. So it's a terrible boredom. Whereas eternity, or heaven, has a complete transformation of the experience of time, to where it's more like a flow state, but an ever deepening mystery that the more you know, the more you want to know. And that's also described very well in Dante's Divine Comedy. In my wings fail this lofty fantasy of why is the human efficacy in the ring within the ring, and so on and so forth. So there's always an aesthetic experience to deeper and deeper within a dance that one is invited to, as Lewis puts at the end of the Space Trilogy. It would seem that the name of the game is to figure out how to treat this life like that. To treat this life as effused with an eternity that the more one experiences, the more they see an ever deeper dimension to be pulled deeper into. To not experience life in terms of a timelessness, of which is just a boring and terrible repetition, but in incompleteness that precisely because of that incompleteness, because of that ever openness that is only possible because of a kind of opening that could be interpreted as a wound. The very thing that could be interpreted as a wound can be the very engine that makes life always worth living. Because, you know, in Christianity, if Jesus doesn't die on the cross, if there is no wound, then nobody gets to heaven. That it's precisely a wound, a suffering, a weakness that then makes eternity and an ever deepening mystery possible. And in this life, it would seem to be that the name of the game is to view wounds, incompleteness, and weakness as the horizon of that possibility, to where the world can always be an ever deeper something worth living. But that would be up to us to have the internal resources to see incompleteness, weakness, and so forth as good, as things that can be sublimated into a life that is always worth living more and more and more. And with that, I will run. Thank you so much for your time. It is always a pleasure. Have a good one. Thank you, everyone.